Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage.
Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. We're Doug and Leslie Davis, and we are so glad that you've joined us here today.
Today we're starting a two-part series. Our first part is on the cornerstone of biblical leadership, being trustworthy and emulating the character of Jesus. And our next part is the biblical characteristics of submission.
And so we know that that's a hot topic right now, whether you're talking about leadership or submission, but we know that they go hand in glove. Without having a heart that submits first to the Lord, leadership from us as individuals can be more difficult than it ought to be. Without proper leadership, submission is incredibly hard. And so what we want to look at, we want to focus today on being trustworthy, which is one of the key pieces, the cornerstone of biblical leadership. And so we want to break it down, understanding it within this context. One of the greatest examples that we have to be leaders was given to us by Christ himself. Now, all of the people of God, the people of Israel, who had been waiting for the Messiah to come, had their own version of what kind of leadership they thought Jesus would bring, what the Messiah would bring. And they didn't understand the kind of leadership that he instead showed and demonstrated and has called us to emulate. We need to make sure that we take the example that was set by Jesus. We love the way he loved. We lead the way he led. And that we're trustworthy the way that he's trustworthy. Now, right away, some of you are probably thinking, hold on. We understand what you're saying, but God is always faithful. I can't be always faithful. Even when I want to be, I'm going to mess up. God loves me no matter what, and there's going to be times where that's going to be really hard for me. But we just want to encourage you that these are the things that Christ set as the perfect example, and those are the things that we need to strive to do, even though we'll just go ahead and admit right now, you all need to admit where you're listening right now, there will be times where you're going to goof it up a little bit, but it doesn't change what we're striving to do.
One of the things that strikes me as very pertinent for this conversation in Christ's leadership was that he didn't lord over anyone. And I think one of the
Even though he was Lord over everyone.
Right. Even though he was Lord over everyone. And a lot of times when we talk about, or when we hear about biblical leadership, it's in the context of servant leadership,
right.
And I think that's important too. But when we talk about just servant leadership, we're going to miss a big point. And that point is what we really want to talk about today. And that's how trustworthy Christ is. Because I think, when you think about a marriage relationship, one of the qualities that we look for as women in our husbands is, are they trustworthy? Because if they're trustworthy, it is really, really easy to follow them.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things for us to remind you all of is that trustworthiness and trust can be really difficult for us to process because it's so easy for us to not do well.
And it's easy to get it mixed up too, because,
right.
They say, well, you should trust me more. You should trust me more. And I hear that in the counseling office
right.
a lot. Well, she doesn't trust me. Mm-hmm. Well, my first question then is, are you being trustworthy?
And both of those things need to be things that we seek to do, that we pursue to do. It's fair to say, while I'm acting in a trustworthy way, I do want you to trust me. It's also absolutely right for you to say, if you want my trust, I need to see something that's trustworthy. Those are both very legitimate things to have as part of the discussion. But too often we don't know what it looks like. And again, what makes it so difficult is trust is something that takes an entire lifetime to build, but it only takes a single moment to lose. And so, being trustworthy is something that's a continuous behavior. The difficulty, and I just want to warn men, don't give up on being trustworthy because of one mistake. Turn around from that mistake, repent of it, and continue to be trustworthy in the things you do moving forward. But ladies, I'll warn you too, that if somebody has done something that wasn't trustworthy and so you've lost trust, don't stay there if they start to act in a trustworthy way again. The mistake is quitting. Men, don't quit just because you messed up once. And women, don't say, I'll never trust you again. Both of those things are something that Satan would love to do to destroy your marriage. Men, if you quit, you're letting the enemy win. Women, if you say, I'll never trust you again, or you'll never move beyond that point where he failed, you're letting the enemy win. Don't let him win.
I think that one of the things is that when, you see a red flag is when you hear yourself saying always or never, that's a time to pause and say, okay, is that really true? So
what are the things that you can do to be trustworthy? So talking to everybody, because all of us have relationships where we get to be the ones who establish the, leadership, trustworthiness, faithfulness. But I'm specifically talking to the men today, even though this applies to absolutely any of us, as far as being faithful and being trustworthy. So what's it look like to be trustworthy the way that Christ was trustworthy? Here's your first thing. Men, be honest. Now, that honesty needs to be wrapped in kindness, because just because something's true doesn't always mean you should say it. But when there's a moment where you know that you need to give an answer, be honest. You don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but it's better to be honest and as kind as you can be than to not be honest. Because even if you thought I'm being compassionate by telling you something that's not true, even if you thought I'm saving grief because we won't fight if I don't share with you what was true, what you're doing is you're temporarily putting off the inevitable, and it is inevitable. And once not being honest comes to light, the longer it sits, the more it ferments. Not being honest is like a smashed grape. It can be wiped up and taken care of relatively quickly when it's done right afterwards. But if it sits and it ferments, it becomes a much more interesting and difficult predicament.
You said to also included in that was to not say anything in order to avoid a fight. Right. That's really dangerous too, because as in our human nature, we tend to infer the negative. Right. And so if there's a void of information, we tend to assume the worst. We tend to not give the benefit of the doubt. So leaving that void of information can really be under a deterrent to the connection in the relationship.
So when should you be silent? If what you're saying doesn't produce any benefit, if it's just critical, and there's nothing that can be learned from it, there's nothing that can be done differently because of it, it's just critical. Those are times where it's absolutely acceptable, and I would encourage you to not say anything. Just because something's true doesn't always mean you need to point it out. However, you all know that there are times that demand an answer. There are times that demand to know what's going on. What are you thinking? What is the current situation involving? And in those times, be honest. When you think about Jesus' example of being honest, he told his closest disciples when he went to pray that he was going to have to be offered up. They didn't want to believe it, but he told them, he was honest with them. And then when he came down and they were sleeping, he told them, your flesh is weak, but pray. And they fell asleep again. But he was honest with them. Your flesh is weak. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He just shared the truth and then shared what needed to be done. And so as often as you can, be honest.
Kind of it wrapped up in that too is, you were coming at it kind of as a point of view of the leadership, right? But there's also the times when being honest is important if there's something that has gone awry.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a kind of a come clean moment. When you're able to come clean and to admit that mistake, openly and give time for healing and reconnection, in that moment, that's a good time to be honest too, as opposed to passing the buck.
Which will lead me to a separate one. Admit when you're wrong. If you want to emulate the character of Christ, have the cornerstone of biblical leadership. Now, Christ, of course, was never wrong, but what he did was he always was direct, always was sharing what was going on. So we as leaders, to be able to always share and to be direct, we need to admit when we're wrong, because Christ never made a mistake, but we do. And so one of the fastest ways for you to be restored into a position of trust because you're acting quickly in a trustworthy way is as soon as you recognize it. And you may not recognize it for a moment or two. You may not recognize it for a little while. But once you recognize what I did was the wrong thing to do, admit when you're wrong so that you can move forward by doing what's right.
Absolutely.
Now, a third thing for you to do to be able to be trustworthy, because it's easy to say be trustworthy, but we've given you a couple examples. Be honest, admit when you're wrong. Here's a third one. Honor your commitments. Now, we know that things come up. There are things that come up that you can't control, but control the things you can control. And so let me share with you what that's going to mean and possibly what it'll look like. If you have a legitimate commitment, you work for someone who has said part of your contract is occasionally you're going to have to work extra hours and you may not know until day of, and you told your wife, I'm going to take you out to dinner at 6 o'clock tonight, and you found out you're working until 6:30. You can't control that. So that's not dishonoring your commitment. However, you need to communicate the things you can't control very quickly, because when you communicate the times when you can't do what you said you do, you're still honoring the commitment. You're showing this mattered to me, and the thing that I can't control, I'm going to communicate to you. But then the other part of it is the things you can control them in a way that lets you honor what you said you would do.
Right.
Because, and again, the reason is it's not even what you're doing that matters. It's building up trust because you honored what you committed to do.
And in that you honored the relationship, your marriage relationship, in being able to communicate that.
Right.
And rescheduling. I mean, like, that would be the honorable thing to do, is to reschedule that.
Right.
In a manner that is not undermining the connection.
Absolutely. So another thing that you can do to be trustworthy is, and this one is going to at first be a little bit counterintuitive. Shouldn't this fall instead in, focusing on the relationship? But it has a lot to do with being trustworthy. Every time you have the opportunity to be helpful, be helpful. And here's why. There are things that you cannot do. There's things that you're not talented enough to do. You've never learned how to do them. Okay? But there are other things that you have been gifted. You know how to do this. You've learned how to do something. Be listening so that when it's possible, you offer help. Now, again, why does that show leadership? Why does that show trustworthiness? It is so much easier to build. It's easier to trust someone when you know that whenever possible, they always have my back and will help when they can. When you establish that as a pattern, when you establish that as a character trait, you're establishing leadership that is easier to follow. And so be helpful. Now, that doesn't mean that you do things for your spouse. Please don't do things that your spouse was doing.
Right.
Well, don't enable them, but also don't interrupt them and take over what they were doing. Don't do that. But always be available to help. Is there something I can do to help you? And then if there is, do it. Because again, when I know that someone is supporting me fully, it's going to be easy for me to be able to say, I can trust them, in a work relationship or in any relationship. And think about how true that is with God. When we know that He's our ever-present help, and He is, look at how much easier it is then to trust Him when He leads us. And so following the leadership example of Christ, help when you're able to help. And then this next one is really big. Stand up for what's right. Now, this is a character issue. This is a character issue as much as it is an action issue. But whenever you can, even when nobody's watching, stand up for what's right. So even if you're the only voice in the room that stands up for what's right, stand up for what's right. Why does that matter? Because when your spouse sees that even when no one else thinks the right thing should be done, you do. Even when nobody else is thinking about, is this a right or wrong issue, and you're pointing out there is a right way to do it, we should look at what's right. All of those things start to show your spouse this is a person who cares about doing what's right, not just doing what's easy. And so you're building a trustworthiness simply because you're willing to do the right thing rather than the quick thing, the easy thing, or the thing everybody else does.
Right, or the self-centered thing.
Right.
Yeah, that a lot of times that's where that comes out. I'll do what's right for me, and not what's right for the family or what's right for whatever. So you're right that those sets of actions build a character profile that is easy to submit to.
Because you're building a consistent pattern, so a consistent character that is a trustworthy character. And again, you're going to mess it up. There will be times where you're going to just mess it up. As quickly as possible, make sure that you turn away from the mess up, admit it, and then continue to do what's right. Because unlike Christ, Christ was perfect. We're not perfect. But like Christ, we can build an established, consistent character that our spouse identifies. But there's another thing that we can do besides being somebody who is trustworthy and faithful. We also can focus on our relationship as a priority to build, that builds some of that. Well, again, it's trustworthiness, but even more importantly, it builds the guidelines through which the relationship can safely exist.
And I think talking about those guidelines and talking about the things that are important to both of you in order to set those guidelines are going to be really important. A lot of couples are on autopilot when they first get married, when they first come into their relationship. And they're bringing in those guidelines from their family of origin, and they don't mesh with their spouse's guidelines from their family of origin. And they don't know how to talk about and reestablish what those guidelines might be.
And so when things don't just immediately mesh, there are times where you can go on autopilot because you're so busy, or you can try to avoid some things that shouldn't be avoided. Instead, they should be things that draw you closer. And instead, we want to encourage you to focus on your relationship as the priority. Now, too many times we do things where the relationship is an afterthought, or the relationship fits within what we're already doing instead of the relationship being a priority. But there are times and places where the relationship needs to be number one. And one of those things will be demonstrated when you recognize there are times when you need to be completely present. What's that going to look like?
Well, I think, when you get, like, for instance, in our situation, when you get home from work and we had tea time. I know we've talked about having tea time before, but tea time was when you got home from work, and I told the girls that they had to wait because our relationship was priority, and we took 15 minutes to reconnect, talk about our day, and then the girls got some attention. Right. Then the girls were able to talk about their day and have some dad time and all this stuff. So in setting that priority, that our relationship was a priority at that time, and then our family was a priority, that those were the guidelines that we followed. So that's what it looked like in our lives, putting the relationship as a priority.
And now what we see is just recently, there was a moment that showed itself as this is a moment where you need to be fully present right now. Let me give you the example without giving a lot of the details. Leslie had gone through a day where she had some personal heartache and some personal hurt that had existed, and she needed to be able to share that. I got home from work, and what we talked about prior to that was I had 2 errands that I needed to run. Both of them were significant. They were important. And then I had a church-related Bible study meeting to take care of as well. And so, the window of time that I had was something that we had planned to do, important and good things that mattered to both of us. But because of what had happened for her that day, it was a moment that showed me very quickly that I needed to be present right now, which meant as I sat down, all of the things that could have been a distraction to giving my full attention had to go away. My phone got set down on top of some printer paper so that even if it vibrated, you wouldn't hear it very much. It got set to the side. I immediately started thinking in my mind of those 2 errands that need to be run. One of them can be done tomorrow. The other one can be done at any time. So that's okay. If we don't get to them, it's fine. which extends the time that I have until the moment that I don't have a choice. I have to be present at this church function. And so there was an immediate shift. I don't think Leslie saw any of the shift on my face, but there was an immediate shift in my brain saying, I need to be present right now. It wasn't what we planned, and that's okay, but I need to be fully present because that's what she's going to need at this moment.
But I did realize the shift in your schedule because I knew your schedule. And so it said a lot that, the difficulties that I needed to unpack, like I needed to talk to somebody about them, and that was one of the times where, I think part of our conversation was, do you need me to fix it or do you just need me to listen? And I did just need you to listen, at that time. And there are times when I need to unload and you need to fix it, but that's usually a tech issue or a car issue.
But that's a good question to ask too, gentlemen, to ask, do you need me to listen? Do you need me to fix it? Because there's a difference. And if you aren't yet familiar with the difference, talk to your wife about it. But there is a difference, and so one of the things that I would also encourage you to do, men, as you try to make sure your relationship is the priority, not just the afterthought. It's not the secondary thing. Is to understand that the things that we do need to be person-centered instead of task-centered. I can very easily be task-centered. I have a to-do list at the beginning of every day, and nearly every day, everything that was on my list gets checked off and it's done. I get a lot of things done in a day. However, the things that I do because the people involved matter. The conversations that I have often are because the people involved matter. There's conversations that I have that the conversation I could take or leave, but the person matters deeply to me. And so when we understand that and we start to apply that to our marriage relationship, we're going to see God bless it in a very interesting way. So let's look at some specific ways that you can be more person-centered so that you're able to be present more in your relationship. One of the things is for you to realize whether you've been married for 6 months, 6 years, 6 decades, that you need to comprehend fully that this is a long-term commitment and you need to value the long term. Now, what do I mean by that? Valuing the long term is going to help you once you really grab hold of that thought, it's going to help you know, when is it okay for me to change my schedule in my head like I did the day that I just described to you? And when's it not? Because there are days where you have to keep a schedule. Communicate with your spouse and say, this matters to me, we're coming back to it. But there's other days where you can dump the things that you had on your plan, on your agenda, and be fully present in that moment. But keep in mind that the balance between the two is because what you have as a husband and wife is a long-term relationship, a long-term commitment. Value the long-term, just not what's just short, quick, or easy.
I think that's really important. And I know like how that started to play out in our marriage early on is, we said, or I said, maybe, I don't know if you said it or not, but I said it with kind of gushy eyes, we're going to grow old together. And,
and we're in the process of
that. Yeah, we're in the process of that. But, early on, it was like we had the long term in our sights because we just knew and are looking forward to it. I mean, We've always looked forward to the next phase of life and enjoyed the phase of life that we're in. So no phase of life has caught us off guard. Right. And so we've just enjoyed growing old together.
And every single part of it, all of it. And so one of the other things that you can do that will help you really focus on the relationship as a priority might be hard for some of us as men. It's not something that a lot of men do naturally. I don't do it naturally. It's something that God has to work on in me for me to be able to do it well. But be vulnerable. Now, that can be dangerous, but remember, this is long term. You've been blessed with a spouse that loves you, that cares for you, and in my case, a spouse that told me from the very beginning, we're going to grow old together and be that old couple holding hands walking through the park. Yeah. And so because you're in it long term, recognize when you need to be vulnerable.
And ladies, I'm just going to step out here and give you a warning. If you see that your husband is being vulnerable or attempting to be vulnerable, handle that with kid gloves, because it is so important that they know that your relationship is a safe place and that they're not going to get stomped on or belittled or berated for that being vulnerable, because their number one fear is that they're going to fail. And in order to make that place safe, you have to be able to positively reinforce the times that they are being vulnerable, because it's really hard for them to be vulnerable. They don't want to fail. They don't want to be put themselves out there in order to find out if they're going to fail.
So let's make sure we understand this and can fix it where the relationship will be blessed by it. Ladies, I'll go ahead and piggyback on what Leslie just shared with you. We often, as men, come across as being super confident, because the times when we don't know what to do, we don't like to share those times with anybody. So you see the confidence, because we share when we know what to do. We come across as bold, because we let people see the times when we take action. But the few times that we're kind of afraid, we don't let people see that. Yeah. And so, over the long term, you may see the things that are very typically manly. You might see a lot of bold action. If your husband's actually willing to share, today, I don't know what to do, and he gets belittled for it, he's not going to share that with you again.
Right, he'll never do it again.
Okay, because it doesn't get shared with anybody else. It doesn't get shared with other men. It doesn't get shared anywhere else. So, again, men, being vulnerable is something over the long term is going to help you to truly be able to develop a leadership style that's trustworthy. And here's why. If your wife knows that you're bold and you act and you know what to do and you know what to do and you know what to do, but the one time you don't, you share with her, I don't know what to do yet. And she receives it properly. She's going to be able to trust you even more, because she knows almost always he knows what to do. I can trust that. And now, the few times he doesn't know what to do, he shares that with me. That will allow the relationship to be a priority in a way that I'm not sure husbands and wives understand enough about.
And I think the connection there is made, the connection in the relationship is made when that vulnerability is shared. You don't know what to do. And then you can extend, what are your ideas?
Right.
And being able to accept, what the wife's ideas are and be able to work and solve that problem together.
Right. And so again, it's going to be a next step kind of situation in building that long-term relationship, focusing on your relationship as a priority. And men, there's one other thing that you can do, focusing on your relationship as a priority, that might not come naturally either. We know that often being vulnerable does not come naturally. This one might not for you either. Show your wife that you care. Now, I want to make sure that this is clear. There will be things that your wife loves that don't interest you at all, but you can show her that you care because it matters to her. There will be things that are going on that affect her very differently than they affect you. You both went through them side by side together. Show her that you care about the way it affected her, even if it didn't affect you the same way. And please don't ever say, I know how you feel when you don't. Just let her know, I see that this is affecting you, and I'm very sorry that it's affecting you that way. Let her know that you care about what she sees, you care about what she experiences, you care about what she feels, even when you don't see those things, you don't experience those things, you don't feel those things. If your wife knows that you recognize and care about her and her circumstances, then you're building that deeper relationship, that long-term relationship, that vulnerable relationship that will allow her to see that you have her best interests at heart. And so because of that, you become more trustworthy.
And you become easier to submit to. Like that's the whole cycle, is that when the husband is trustworthy, Trust is an outcropping of that. And when you have trust in your leader, you are able to position yourself behind them and let them lead. And that is how God designed marriage.
And so again, we do want to remind you that the difficulty of this topic is that trust takes an entire lifetime to build. And it does only take a split second to lose, but it doesn't have to stay lost. You know, you may find yourself in a position where there has been an event that caused trust to be lost between you. Admit what happened, and from this moment forward, begin the process of rebuilding trust. Okay? Men, don't quit just because you failed once. Ladies, don't say, for the rest of my life, I will never trust you because you failed once. Both of those things will damage your relationship, and God has something better for you.
Absolutely.
So, being trustworthy is the cornerstone of biblical leadership. Next week, we're going to look at what it looks like to submit to leadership. And we know that God will meet you where you are and help you to be able to develop through these difficult topics that are really blessed and good topics. And so we continue to pray that God will solidify your marriage. We're Doug and Leslie Davis. This is the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast.